Congress, the American people chose an evenly split Senate.
It gives me great pride to serve as Speaker of the most diverse House of Representatives in the history of our country.
Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Jackie Alamany, anchor of the early 202 newsletter at the Washington Post and also a congressional correspondent. In the last week, cyber attacks have become a top concern for many officials worldwide. My guest today is Representative John Katko, ranking member of the House Homeland Security Committee. Representative Katko, welcome back to Post Live. Thanks for joining us on this extraordinarily busy week.
Thanks for having me. I'm getting hungry looking at that cupcake jar behind you.
Unfortunately, it's not edible. And I want to give a reminder to our audience. We want you to join in our conversation. So please tweet your questions and comments to the handle @PostLive. Congressman, I know you're just out of the House Republican conference meeting this morning. We're told that Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, who is Ukrainian, spoke. Can you give us a readout of her message to her colleagues this morning?
Well, I was not there for that portion of the meeting, but I spoke to Victoria last night. She's full of angst, obviously, for the Ukrainian people and where she came from, as all of us are. You know, I have relatives in Ukraine right now that I'm terribly about, as all of us are. And her message is one of real concern. And I think one of her messages that she said last night, and I'm sure she said today, was the real story about what's going on over there is probably much worse than what's being reported. And that's a real concern going forward. There's real human tragedy going on, and it was wholly unnecessary on the part of Putin. And, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us to support them in every way we possibly can and to make life as difficult as we can for the Russians so that maybe, just maybe, they'll wake up and realize that this isn't worth it and stop this nonsense.
Well, and on that comment that you just made about things being likely being worse than we realize, is that the sense that you got from senior administration officials last night at a classified briefing? I know there's obviously only so many details you can share about that, but that things are worse than we realize, including casualty counts at the moment?
Well, I can't reveal what's classified information, but I can tell you generally that there are heavy casualties and that there's also weapons that the Russians have that they are implementing that and are reportedly implementing that are basically truly awful in nature. And I think that's what Victoria was referring to, and that's what folks were referring to last night. And it's been reported in the media as well. And trying to figure out exactly what those weapons are and how they're being used. There's some pretty awful weapons that they're going to implement. There's been reports of cluster bombs and these other things that are really awful.
What about nuclear weapons? Has the U.S. detected any change in Russia's nuclear posture since Putin's order went out on Sunday?
No, and in fact, I think the United States, if they thought it was a real eventuality, their nuclear forces would have been on higher alert than they are right now, and we just have to be careful with what we're doing. I know there's some alert and there's some heightened alert, but I think basically they're taking a wait and see approach, and obviously we're monitoring the situation very, very closely. When you start talking about nuclear weapons, it really indicates, it's indicative of the instability with respect to Putin. To casually throw that out there like he did is really a sign of someone, a world leader who is not really as stable as he should be, and that's a very big concern.
So I take it you don't agree with the former President Trump's assessment that Vladimir Putin is a genius?
No, I don't think either one of them are.
And I want to get back to the House GOP conference meeting quickly. Did House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy address any of the issues that bubbled up with the conference over the weekend about two House Republicans who participated in a white nationalist conference, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know if they did or not after I left, but I can tell you one thing, that racism and those types of conferences are anathema to the American public. And if they were there, I don't know any of the details, but if they were there, they should be called out on that. And I'm sure that, you know, they're going to deal with that going forward. But make no mistake about it, that type of rhetoric is hurtful and harmful, and it's something that we should put in a rearview mirror in America and never talk about again. And for them to going to places where that stuff is discussed is, to me, is very, very deeply troubling, if in fact they engage in that conduct. So going forward, I'm sure that's something we'll be discussing more.
And obviously, the two of them have already faced some punitive measures from House Democrats. But what about from Republicans? Do you think it's time for Republicans to censure them or take more action in some way for these continued behaviors?
Well, with respect to Marjorie Taylor Greene, they already have. I mean, she's not on any committee. So going forward, I think it's something we have to examine the facts and proceed accordingly. I'm hesitant not to talk about the particulars because I don't know them, but I'm just talking generally that from a general standpoint, this type of conduct cannot be tolerated.
Now, I want to get back to Ukraine. Why isn't the U.S. telling Ukrainians to cut a deal with the Russians before more people die? And is that something that you think the administration should be considering?
I don't think the Ukrainian people want that. And let's not forget, the Ukrainian people are hardy souls. They're strong. They're determined. They're independent-minded. And if you look back after World War II, they resisted Stalin for close to 10 years. It's in their DNA to be independent and free. And when they gained their freedom from the Soviet Union many years ago, they had nuclear weapons, a ton of them in Ukraine. And they gave them up with the promise that they would be protected going forward. And it's sad to see that they really haven't been protected. Now, I'm not calling for U.S. military intervention or NATO military intervention, but at some point, you got to say to yourself, when does that red line, the red line, as far as atrocities and everything else goes, when does it change that dynamic? And I'm concerned that we're fast approaching that. And for me, for any administration to take a military intervention off the table and then repeatedly say that to the bad guy is akin to me when I was a prosecutor saying to the gangbangers who were wreaking havoc in our cities that I prosecuted them in, saying, look, we're going to work with you, but we're not going to prosecute you. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to run crazy in the city. And that's what Putin is doing right now. So I want to stress, I'm not calling for military intervention, but taking it off the table reduces a huge deterrent effect. And now we're in a situation where we're trying to get weapons to a government and a people that are getting by the minute getting more and more encircled by their enemies. So it's a real concern going forward. And what do we do if these atrocities spike and they really skyrocket? We start seeing dead children in the streets and dead women in the streets. What are you going to do with them, right? And just keep trying to wrap their knuckles with sanctions? But he doesn't care about sanctions. And I can't say enough. I'm not saying we should take military intervention, but the same token, we should not have taken one of our key strengths off the table from the beginning. And as far as the Ukrainian people go, if they want peace with Russia, they can have it, but they want to fight and they're ready to fight. And as all they've asked for us for months is getting some assistance so they can fight for themselves.
And we reported last night that senior administration officials told House lawmakers that they expected an insurgency from the current situation to phase into an insurgency in 3 to 4 weeks. The inference being that the capital would potentially be taken by Russia along with leadership. Do any American officials think that Ukrainians can actually prevail against Russia here?
I think the prevailing wisdom is that, sadly, that Russia will ultimately prevail. They have overwhelming force. They have overwhelming supplies. So I think ultimately, we're praying. Everyone's praying for a miracle, but ultimately, I think people understand that it's highly likely that it'll turn into an insurgency within a matter of weeks, if not months. We're hopeful that the contrary happens, but I think realistically, you got to understand that that's probably what's going to happen, and that's why the sanctions, the more severe the sanctions can be at this point, might get embolden the Russian people themselves to stand up to their despotic leader, who's really clearly become unbalanced, and stand up to him once and for all and ask for a change in Russia that may make the situation go away.
And have you received any new estimates for the amount of casualties the U.S. expects Ukrainians to suffer during the fighting?
Nothing, only in a classified setting, but they are quite significant, no question about it.
Yeah. And what is your assessment of the Biden administration's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine versus their response to the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan?
You know, I think the key term you used is response, because we are in response mode. What you have to do is take a step back to before the response, when they had an opportunity to influence things in a different way. like I already said, taking military actions off the table immediately doesn't help. Waiting till last minute to get lethal aid, that's missiles and what have you, javelin missiles and what have you to the Ukrainian people, was a mistake. Not having the sanctions ready to roll right away was a mistake. Are they doing better with sanctions now? Are they tightening the sanctions with their response? Absolutely. But really, when bad guys sense weakness, they will exploit the weakness. And that's what Putin did. He sensed the weakness of this administration, and it's emblematic of how they handled Afghanistan and other crises, and how they didn't respond to the major cyber attacks we've had from China and Russia over the last year or two. And so I think the bad guys are looking at this and they're saying, well, I don't think Biden's going to do anything, so we're going in. And then you look at China and Taiwan, and they're looking at Taiwan going, and she's looking very close to what's happening here with respect to Russia. So, however, whatever the shortcomings were this administration before the invasion, the response, I think, has been pretty good. And I think they need to continue to respond in the manner they're doing. And I think by its very nature, it caused NATO to come together, because NATO wasn't on the same page before the invasion. Now, not only is everybody in NATO countries on the same page, you have countries like Finland and Sweden, who are generally very, very against joining NATO, are talking about joining NATO. So it's been a sea change in NATO. And so, ironically, Putin went into this partly to ensure that Ukraine didn't become part of NATO. And now NATO's going to be stronger than ever. And so just a lot to go with this going forward, a lot of moving parts. But I think the administration has done a pretty good job with respect to the sanctions. I think we should do more with respect to oil and cut off their oil supply to the West. We could do that by the president temporarily, at least temporarily, rolling back a lot of his restrictive policies with respect to oil production in the U.S. And at a minimum would send a signal to the markets that would lessen the severity of cutting off Russian oil to the U.S. And I think we ought to think about really going hardcore and doing that. That would show real leadership by the president.
What about a strategic oil reserve release? Is that something that you think should be under consideration as well from
Absolutely.
NATO allies?
Look, if the president would cut off Russian oil supplies to the West, and we all just put on our chin straps and figured out how to get better production in the U.S., for example, it would go a long way towards really putting a major stranglehold on Russia. Because at this very moment, think about this, and I don't know if viewers understand this. When they're going to the gas tank right now, it's highly likely that some of the stuff that's going into their vehicles is oil that came from oil that came from Russia. And we're funding, in part, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is pure insanity by my standards. So we've got to do something about that.
And quickly before we pivot to the topic of cyber attacks, which you touched on, this further unification of NATO allies and countries who were not previously part of NATO, how much credit does Joe Biden get for that?
Well, listen, it happened on his watch, so he should get credit. Listen, whether it was because of his actions or just because of the actions of Russia, it doesn't really matter. It happened on his watch, and so that's a good thing. And if you may or may not know, I'm one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, so I'm not one to call out the other side just for the sake of calling him out. And that's why I say if it happened on his watch, he should take credit for it. But regardless, it's a good thing that NATO seems to be reconstituting, understanding that their core mission is to protect the spread of bad leaders like Putin. And this is clearly a sterling example of that.
And as you're well aware, top of mind right now is the growing threat of a cyber attack. Are we in a place to be able to handle the tidal wave of new forms of warfare, most specifically those prompted by cyber warfare?
I think the most important thing you just said there is warfare. And people have got to understand that modern war is a key component of modern war is cyber attacks. And if you look, Russia, before they went into Ukraine, launched a massive cyber attack to basically soften them up a little bit. And every credible army in the world has a cyber command within it, and the U.S. has a very robust cyber command. So going forward, we have to understand that from a war standpoint, cyber is always going to be there. But not just when you're in war. If you look at the last few years, look at what's happened in the U.S. The Russian cyber attacks on the U.S. that basically went unchecked by this administration. The JBS attack on the food supply, the Colonial Pipeline, and others. Russia doesn't, the state of Russia doesn't do the cyber attacks themselves. There are many robust cyber gangs within Russia that do the cyber attacks, and they do it under the imprimatur cyber attacks. And it's highly likely that more cyber attacks are coming. And we have to be ready for them. And that's why we spent a lot of time at Homeland Security over the last several years establishing CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and then beefing it up repeatedly. And Jen Easterly, who runs CISA now, has done a yeoman's work over there, getting them up to speed. And right now, we have something called Shields Up over at CISA. And any entity, whether you're an individual or a business or a government entity, can go to Shields Up and get help to help you harden your systems and find out where the holes are. Because I think the message is, assume you're the next to be hacked. Assume that you're the next one that's going to be attacked and act accordingly. Colonial Pipeline came to Congress after their attack and told us how all the things they were doing to harden their system. And I thought to myself, where was this ahead of time? Why wasn't that there ahead of time? And I think every system has to understand we're in a very high cyber threat right now. We need to have the collaborative resources of CISA and the private sector working together through Shields Up and other entities to harden their systems as best they can, assuming that attacks are coming. Because if you do that, you lessen the severity of the attacks long term. And the best way of liking it, I guess, is if you drive a car that is very unsafe and you get an accident, probably toast, right? If you are a very safe car when you get an accident, much more likely to survive and much more likely to recover from it. And it's the same way with respect to cyber. You've got to put resources into it, and you've got to have a good car to drive.
Who is most vulnerable to whatever cyber attacks might be coming?
I think system-wide, we're all vulnerable. I mean, some financial institutions, for example, though, they're getting attacked many times a second. So their cyber security apparatus is quite robust. So maybe other sectors, especially some critical infrastructure sectors, may not be as secure as they should be. Look at the Colonial Pipeline incident. It wasn't as secure as it should be. And we have to do that with respect to others, critical infrastructure systems as well. I can't really tell you which ones are and which ones aren't, but I can tell you most of them are not where they should be. And we need to keep continuing to get them in a better state than they are right now. And it takes money, and they got to do it.
A 2021 communique showed that NATO would weigh whether to trigger Article 5 on the grounds of a cyber attack. How does Article 5 apply to cyber warfare, and what kind of cyber attack should be categorized as an attack on a member of NATO?
No, that's a great question, because that is really thinking about warfare in the modern realm, like we have to. And I think that is a discussion that needs to be had. And if you have a catastrophic cyber attack that shuts down your grids or shuts down your ability to keep your people warm or in the winter or fed or what have you, I think we've got to figure that out. I think NATO needs to get together and have those very difficult decisions, because it is a component of war, as I said before, and I think it needs to be viewed as such.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Is NATO's cyber policy as developed as it should be?
I think it's evolving. Do they have more to go? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and others have been sort of raising alarms about this for years now. So YouTube allows Russian websites known for propaganda to make money from ads on its platforms. Do you think that social media company should ban Russian state media?
Well, I can tell you right now they should, at a minimum, if they're bad actors. And I think it's incumbent upon them from a moral standpoint. Why enrich bad people? It's just like us enriching them with oil. That's immoral in my mind. And so why enrich them by allowing them to advertise on your platforms? And I think you see a lot of companies around the world that are doing just that. They're cutting off Russia and Russia-based entities. And I think that these platforms should do the same. Lord knows they do the same with respect to bad actors on our side of the fence. So they should do it for them as well, for sure.
And Congressman, if we take a step back, you've been drawing attention to the issue of safeguarding our cybersecurity again for quite some time. What does the current threat landscape look like compared to when you first started to champion the idea that government should step up to the plate to prepare against potential cyber threats?
I think the cyber threat is very high right now, but I also I'm heartened by the fact that we have improved so much over the last few years since CISA came into existence, from a overall cyber readiness and overall cybersecurity awareness. And awareness, as you know, was the first step towards hardening your systems, and awareness is the first step towards dealing with any problem. And CISA and the other agencies in the federal government have really done a good job with respect to that. But there's a lot more to go. For example, is multi-factor authentication really where it should be? No. Is every entity out there really hardening their systems where they should? No, because CEOs will make a choice and say, we can, their cyber guy comes to them and tells them, we need $10 million to harden our system. And the guy goes, I'm not going to spend that. The heck with that. But then they get attacked, and then you figure it out. And the more that they see these attacks coming and the devastation that these attacks bring, the more they're stepping up to the plate. And CISA is also helping too. CISA can do threat hunting on private sector or government agency systems. They can go in and kind of give you a checkup and kind of kick the tires and look at your system and say, do it all for free and say, hey, you've got problems here, you need to fix this. And they can fix them. So the threat is higher because of the posturing with Russia right now, and Russia is one of the worst actors with respect to cyber attacks. But I also can tell you that I think we are at a much better place from a defensive posture than we have been in years, and perhaps ever.
And before we change topics to the State of the Union and your retirement, I realized I wanted to seek some clarification on a question I had asked you at the beginning of our conversation. You had said that neither of them are geniuses when I asked you about Trump's comment that Putin is a genius. Were you referring to Trump and Vladimir Putin?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to be clear. The president is obviously set to address the country tonight in the State of the Union address. What will you be listening for him to say or announce?
I would very much love to hear. First of all, he should get credit for the sanctions he's done. And like I said, the horse is already out of the barn about the weakness he portrayed prior to Russia coming in. But that's something we're going to have to deal with down the road. But moving forward, I think I would very much like to hear him say that he's going to temporarily suspend some of the restrictive programs he's initiated in this country for oil production, at least unless and until the Russian crisis is over, so that they can better choke off Russia's economy. Because that's the only thing that's really going to help Russia stand down, is we help them choke off their economy. And all these sanctions are nice and good and productive and helpful, but that would really hit them where it hurts. So I would love to hear that from him going forward. And quite frankly, we've had enough of divisiveness on both sides of the fence, and he's been a disappointment in that regard in his first year. And so I would love to hear from him a lot more of a unifying message and a bipartisan message. We really haven't seen that. A lot of his major legislation has been unilaterally imposed. And I would love to see, and I don't care if he's a Republican or a Democrat, if he wants to work on a bipartisan basis, I'm here to work with him, and a lot of us are. And I sat in the Oval Office with him in February and to talk about the infrastructure deal, and I ultimately supported it. And I caught a lot of heat for it, but it was worth it. And I think we'd love to hear things that are going to unite this country. I think the American people are sick and tired of all the divisiveness. And he would show true courage if he could do the oil, take those steps I laid out for the oil. But also, he would do well to try and unite the country instead of continuing to be divisive.
Yeah, and in addition to supporting the infrastructure bill, you were also one of the 10 Republicans who joined Democrats to vote to impeach former President Trump after the insurrection at the Capitol. Did this, along with President Trump's call to get rid of all 10 Republicans that voted against him, contribute to your decision not to run again?
Not at all. In fact, I was quite certain, even with the redistricting that was done in New York State, that I had a path of victory, and I had a very good path of victory. I think a lot of people on both sides of the fence understand what courage is, and understands what stepping out is, and understands what taking brave stances are, and that's what they like to see in leaders, and that's exactly what I like to see, and I would like to see with respect to Biden. And so, no, it didn't. Quite frankly, I've been in government service for 32 years, since I was 28 years old. I'm staring down 60 in November. And you're supposed to say, we don't look that. But and I just understood, there's never a good time to leave, and there's unfinished business. But there's things I want to do in the private side, and I think for the rest of my life, until I take my last breath, I'm going to be doing things that are involved with helping keep our country safe. That's all I know how to do as an adult, because that's all I've ever done. And I'm going to continue to do that. It's time for me to step away. And you know what? We should have people doing that more in this office. And we don't need people here for 30, 40 years. I'm a very big believer in term limits. And I said it before I ran, and I still believe it now, that change is good. And I think that the next person that comes up and runs a Homeland Security Committee will be great, whoever it is. And that's a good thing for our country. And this is a citizen democracy. It's not something where you work. I don't believe you should have a job here for 30 or 40 years. I just don't think that's what our founders envisioned.
Well, in the spirit of your newfound freedom and candor, what do you think the former president's effect has been on the Republican Party, and has it been damaging?
Well, I think, damaging, it's hard to say. He won, and a lot of his policies were very good. And we did a lot of good things. We had tax reform. We projected much more strength on the world stage, which kept bad guys like Putin in check. A lot of good things that president did. But I think I agree with Attorney General Barr and others that sometimes his inability to discipline himself with respect to his rhetoric really hurt him. And that's the biggest concern I had with respect to the president. And, going forward, does he have a role to play in the party? Absolutely. But should he be the party standard bearer? In my opinion, no, but others feel differently. And that's what conventions are for, and that's what primaries are for. And I think we have a wonderful bench of really highly qualified people for 2024, and we'll see what happens going forward. I think it's going to be, I think it'll be very interesting to see how it is going forward. I don't think he's going to run away with anything. He obviously would be the front runner, but there's obviously a lot of highly qualified people that could do a very good job. And if he could tone down his rhetoric, he would be very formidable.
And you worked with your colleague, Congressman Benny Thompson, to establish the January 6th Commission. Obviously, that was met with resistance and did not work out. But what is your assessment of what the committee ultimately turned into and the work that they've been doing so far?
Well, the biggest thing I was concerned with, because I have a law enforcement perspective, is that how do we keep the Capitol safer? And how do we make sure the Capitol Hill Police is a much better police force than it was, because clearly that day they showed their shortcomings. And those are two things I haven't heard a lot of hearings on, a lot of discussion on. And that's the one thing I would have really liked to see more of. And that's what my commission would have focused on. So has it become more partisan? Yeah, of course. There's far more Democrats and Republicans on there, and it's not a balanced committee. My committee would have had to have consensus for every subpoena that was issued from Democrats and Republicans. And my committee would have ended on December 31st of this past year, which would have given us some clarity as to in moving forward. So instead, it seems to be dragging out. And I think, Benny Thompson's a fine man and he's a good friend of mine. And he's doing what he thinks right, and I respect him for that. I just wish that we had I wish the commission focused on the safety and security of the Capitol and the improvement of the Capitol Police.
And Congressman, you said that passing the infrastructure deal was one of your top accomplishments. What is topping your agenda for items that you want to finish before you leave office?
There's three of them: cybersecurity, cybersecurity, and cybersecurity. To me, I'm very, very concerned about that going forward. It's not my sole focus, but it is a disproportionate large focus what we're doing on Homeland Security right now, because that really is a big thing.
And Congressman, before we wrap up, I want to ask you the message that you have to convey to being one of the more moderate voices of your party before you depart Congress.
Sure. Listen, when I came in, I said I want to be a moderate, and my entire career, I maintained that status as one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. I don't think that's a stain. I think that's what our founders envisioned. I think that's what we once were as an entity in Congress on both sides of the aisle. I think that the rhetoric is so overheated down here, and I think it's sad when you see so many good people get subsumed by the partisan politics. I think people back home are sick of it. And if you look at it in your marital relations or your personal relations with people or in business deals, no one gets 100% of what they want. But down here, it seems like that's what they want. And if they don't get that, then you're a pariah. And to me, that's not how it works. You got to cut deals, you move on and do what's good for the country as a whole, not just the part of the country that you think you believe in politically.
Well, Congressman, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, but congratulations on your retirement, and thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, and have a good day.
And everyone, thanks per usual for joining us. Please visit WashingtonPostLive.com for more information about our scheduling and guests to come.